At our Christmas dinner, my wife announced she'd been having an affair with my brother. She smiled and said, "It's better to be with a young rich man than an old failure." Everyone laughed at me. I quietly went to the bedroom. And when I came back, they had the worst surprise of their lives. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. My name is Richard, and at 67 years old, I thought I had seen every form of cruelty life could offer. I was wrong. The worst betrayal of my life happened on Christmas Eve, in front of my entire family, with Nancy's perfectly manicured hand resting on my brother Scott's arm, as she smiled at me like a predator who had just cornered her prey. The dining room was decorated exactly as it had been for the past 15 years of our marriage. Red tablecloth, golden candles flickering in the crystal holders Nancy insisted we use only for special occasions, and the expensive china set she had bought with my credit card 3 years ago. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air, mixed with the sound of forced laughter and clinking glasses. My sister Margaret sat across from me with her husband, my nephew David and his wife, and Scott, my younger brother, who everyone had always considered the family success story. I should have seen it coming. The signs had been there for months. Nancy's sudden interest in working out at the gym where Scott was a trainer, her new clothes, the expensive perfume, the way she would light up whenever his name was mentioned. But at 67, after 32 years of marriage, you don't expect your wife to announce her infidelity like she's sharing the weather forecast. "I have something to tell everyone," Nancy said, standing up with her wine glass in hand. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her red dress hugging her 58-year-old figure in a way that made it clear she was dressed to impress someone. That someone wasn't me. The table fell silent. Margaret looked up expectantly, probably thinking Nancy was going to announce some charity event or vacation plan. David's wife stopped mid-bite of her mashed potatoes. Scott leaned back in his chair with a smile that I now realize was pure anticipation. "Richard and I are getting divorced," she announced, her voice clear and confident. "I've been having an affair with Scott for the past 8 months. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, each second stretching into eternity. Margaret's fork clattered against her plate. David's mouth hung open. But it was what Nancy said next that shattered what was left of my dignity. "I mean, let's be honest," she continued, taking a sip of wine as if we were discussing the football game. "It's better to be with a young, successful man than an old failure, don't you think?" Scott laughed, actually laughed, a deep, throaty sound that filled the room like poison gas. "Sorry, brother," he said, not looking sorry at all, "but you had your chance to make something of yourself." That's when the rest of them started laughing too. Not nervous, uncomfortable laughter. Real, genuine amusement at my expense. Margaret tried to hide her smile behind her napkin. David shook his head like I was some kind of joke he'd heard before. My nephew's wife actually giggled. "Richard always was the dreamer in the family," Margaret said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Always talking about his big plans but never following through. At least now Nancy can be with someone who actually achieved something," David added, raising his glass toward Scott like he was toasting a business deal. I sat there, my hands gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles went white. 32 years of marriage. 32 years of providing for Nancy, of loving her, of building what I thought was a life together. And this was how it ended, with laughter. With my own family treating me like I was nothing more than an obstacle that had finally been removed. Nancy leaned down and kissed Scott right there at the table, her hand running through his hair while she looked directly at me. "Don't take it personally, Richard," she said, her voice sweet as honey and twice as poisonous. "You're just not the kind of man a woman dreams about anymore." The pain in my chest was physical, like someone had reached inside and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. I looked around the table at faces I had known my entire life, people I had helped, supported, loved, and all I saw was contempt, amusement, relief that someone had finally said out loud what they had all been thinking. But as I sat there, something strange happened. The pain began to transform into something else, something colder, something that felt like steel forming in my chest. I thought about the manila folder in my bedroom dresser, the one Nancy had never bothered to look through. I thought about the conversations I'd had with my lawyer 6 months ago. I thought about the phone calls I'd made to certain people in certain offices over the past year. "Excuse me," I said quietly, pushing back from the table. My voice was steady, controlled. "I need to get something from the bedroom." Nancy waved her hand dismissively, already turning back to Scott. "Take your time, sweetheart. We'll be right here." More laughter followed me as I walked down the hallway toward our bedroom. Their voices carried through the house, discussing their plans, their future together, how much better everything would be now that the dead weight had been removed from the situation. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom I had shared with Nancy for over 3 decades, looking at the king-sized bed with its expensive sheets, the walk-in closet full of clothes she'd bought with money she thought came from Scott's success, the jewelry box on her dresser filled with gifts from a man she believed was wealthy. I walked to my dresser and opened the bottom drawer, pushing aside old sweaters until I found what I was looking for. The manila folder was thick, stuffed with documents that represented 15 years of careful planning, 15 years of decisions I had made in silence, while everyone around me assumed I was just getting older and more irrelevant. I pulled out my phone and made a call I had been planning to make for months. "It's time," I said, when the voice answered. "Yes, I'm sure. Tomorrow morning I want everything transferred back to my name, all of it." And when I hung up, I caught my reflection in the mirror above Nancy's dresser. The old man staring back at me didn't look broken anymore. He looked dangerous. I tucked the folder under my arm and walked back toward the dining room, where the laughter was still echoing through the house. They had no idea what was coming. They had no idea that the old failure they were mocking had been playing a much longer game than any of them realized. As I reached the dining room door, I could hear Nancy telling Scott about the vacation they were going to take to Hawaii, using money she assumed would come from his accounts. Scott was promising her a new car, a bigger house, a life of luxury, with a man who actually knew how to provide for a woman. I smiled for the first time that evening. Tomorrow they were going to learn exactly who had been providing for whom all these years. I stood outside the dining room door, listening to their voices plan my replacement, and my mind drifted back to how it all began. How did I become the family joke? How did 32 years of marriage turn into a punchline delivered over Christmas dinner? The truth was, it started long before Nancy. It started with Scott. Growing up, Scott was the golden child. 3 years younger than me, he had our mother's charm and our father's ability to talk his way out of any situation. While I was the one who helped Dad with the family hardware store after school, Scott was playing football and dating cheerleaders. While I was studying business and accounting at community college, Scott was dropping out of state after 2 semesters to pursue his dream of becoming a professional athlete. When Dad had his first heart attack at 55, I was 26 and had just started working as a bookkeeper for a small construction company. Scott was 23 and training for what he called his big break in professional baseball. Guess who came home to help run the family business? "Richard's always been the responsible one," Mom would say, her voice heavy with exhaustion as she tried to manage Dad's medication schedule and keep the store running. "Scott has so much potential, but Richard knows how to handle the practical things." Practical. That was the word that followed me my entire life. Richard is practical. Richard is reliable. Richard will take care of it. Never Richard is smart or ambitious or deserving of his own dreams. I met Nancy when I was 35. She was 26, beautiful, and working as a receptionist at the construction company, where I had worked my way up to office manager. She had big dreams, she told me. She wanted to travel, to live in a nice house, to have the kind of life she saw in magazines. I thought I could give her that life. I thought I could be enough. For the first few years of our marriage, I was. I had taken over the family store when Dad retired, and I was slowly expanding it. 2 locations became 3, then 4. I wasn't making Scott-level money, but we were comfortable. Nancy seemed happy, or at least content. But then Scott got injured playing semi-professional baseball and needed to find a real job. I was the one who offered him a position managing one of my store locations. I was the one who co-signed the loan when he wanted to open his own gym. I was the one who helped him buy his first house when his credit wasn't good enough for a mortgage. And slowly, gradually, Nancy started comparing us. "Scott really knows how to take risks," she would say, after we'd had dinner at his house, admiring his new furniture or the renovations he was making. "He's not afraid to go after what he wants." Amashi. "Scott's gym is doing so well," she'd mention casually while we watched television. "He's thinking about opening a second location. Isn't that exciting?" What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Scott's gym was failing. His house was mortgaged to the point where he was 3 months behind on payments. His car was leased, his furniture was financed, and his bank account was consistently overdrawn. I knew because I was the one bailing him out, month after month, year after year. But I kept quiet. I kept writing the checks, making the payments, covering his mistakes. Because that's what the responsible brother does, right? That's what Richard does. He handles the practical things while Scott lives his dreams. The worst part was watching Nancy fall for the illusion I was helping to maintain. She started dressing differently when she knew we'd see Scott. She would light up when he told his stories about his successful business, his plans for expansion, his vision for the future. She would look at me afterward with disappointment, like she was wondering what had happened to my ambition. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" she asked me one night after Scott had shown us his new car, a BMW he had leased with money I'd loaned him. "He's younger than you, but he's accomplished so much more." I wanted to tell her the truth. I wanted to explain that everything she admired about Scott was built on my money, my credit, my willingness to clean up his messes. But I didn't. I told myself I was protecting him, protecting the family peace. Really, I was just too tired to fight. The hardware stores weren't glamorous, but they were solid. While Scott was playing entrepreneur with gyms and personal training and get-rich-quick schemes, I was quietly building something real. I expanded into home improvement supplies, then contracting services. I bought properties when the market was low, fixed them up, and either sold them or rented them out. But I never talked about it. I never bragged or showed off or made Nancy feel like she was married to a successful man. I just quietly worked, quietly saved, quietly built a foundation that could support not just us, but Scott's fantasies too. And Nancy grew more distant every year. She stopped asking about my day. She stopped suggesting we take trips or make plans together. She started spending more time at Scott's gym, first as a member, then as someone who just liked to hang around and chat with the trainer. She started working out more, buying new clothes, getting her hair done more often. I told myself it was a midlife crisis. I told myself she would work through it and remember what we had together. I told myself that 32 years of marriage meant something, that the woman who had promised to love me in sickness and in health wouldn't throw it all away for a fantasy. I was wrong. The phone calls started 6 months ago. Nancy would step outside to take them, saying it was her sister or a friend from work. But I could hear her laugh in a way she hadn't laughed with me in years. I could see her checking her reflection before she answered, smoothing her hair and adjusting her clothes like she was about to see someone she wanted to impress. When I confronted her, she denied everything. When I pressed, she turned it back on me. "You're being paranoid, Richard," she said, her voice cold and dismissive. "Just because you've given up on life doesn't mean everyone else has to." Given up on life. Like building a business, supporting a family, and keeping Scott's world from collapsing was giving up on life. 3 months ago, I finally hired a private investigator. Not because I wanted to catch her, but because I needed to know for sure. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. The photos arrived 2 weeks later. Nancy and Scott at restaurants I couldn't afford on my practical income. Nancy and Scott at hotels, holding hands, kissing in parking lots. Nancy and Scott planning a future that didn't include the man who had made it all possible. The investigator's report was thorough. Text messages about how Nancy deserved better than an old failure. Conversations about how Scott was finally ready to take care of a woman properly. Plans for Nancy to file for divorce once she was sure Scott could support her in the style she wanted. That's when I made my phone calls. That's when I started putting certain plans into motion. That's when I decided that if they wanted to play games with money and success and who deserved what, we would play by rules they didn't know existed. Now, standing outside the dining room where my wife was planning her future with my brother, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: anticipation. They thought they knew who Richard was. They thought they knew what Richard was capable of. Tomorrow, they were going to learn that the practical brother had been playing a much more sophisticated game than anyone realized. I straightened my shoulders, tightened my grip on the manila folder, and walked back into the room where they were still laughing. I walked back into the dining room carrying the manila folder, and the first thing I noticed was how comfortable they all looked. Nancy had moved her chair closer to Scott's, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Margaret was leaning forward, hanging on every word, as Scott described the expansion plans for his gym empire. David was nodding appreciatively, like he was getting investment advice from Warren Buffett himself. "There he is," Nancy said, without looking at me, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We were just talking about Scott's new fitness franchise. He's going to have locations in 3 states by next year." Scott's chest puffed out with pride. "I've got investors lined up, partnerships in the works. It's going to be huge, Richard. The kind of success you always talked about but never quite achieved." The laughter that followed felt like acid in my ears. I set the manila folder down on the table right next to Nancy's wine glass. She glanced at it with mild curiosity, probably expecting divorce papers or some pathetic attempt to win her back. "Before we continue planning your bright future," I said, my voice calm and steady, "I think there are a few things you should know about Scott's business empire." Scott's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Come on, Richard, don't be bitter, just because you never had the vision to think big." I opened the folder and pulled out the first set of documents, property deeds, all of them. I spread them across the table like I was dealing cards, each one landing with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. "You're right, Scott," I said, looking directly at him. "I never had the vision to think big. That's why 15 years ago, when you were about to lose everything because of your gambling debts, I only bought these small properties to help you out." Nancy leaned forward to look at the papers, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. "What is this?" I picked up the deed to Scott's house, the one Nancy had admired so many times. "This is the deed to Scott's beautiful home, the one he's been so proud of." Notice the name on the ownership line. Nancy's face went pale as she read my name in bold black letters. "Richard Kellerman, sole owner." "That's impossible," Scott said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "I bought that house. I make the payments." "No," I said, pulling out a bank statement. "You make rent payments, to me, have been for the past 15 years. I turned to Nancy, whose mouth was hanging open. "Did you know that, sweetheart? Did your successful boyfriend mention that he's been my tenant all these years?" Margaret grabbed one of the deeds, studying it closely. "The gym properties too?" I nodded, pulling out more documents. "All 3 locations. The equipment, the business licenses, even the cars in the parking lot. I bought everything when Scott's creditors were circling like vultures. He was 6 months away from bankruptcy, and I stepped in to save him." The silence in the room was deafening. Nancy was staring at Scott like she'd never seen him before. Scott was looking at the papers like they were written in a foreign language he couldn't quite understand. "You're lying," Nancy whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone and showed her the banking app, scrolling through months of payments. "Here's last month's rent from Scott, $2,800 for the house. Here's the lease payment for the gyms, $4,500 per location, monthly. And here," I scrolled to another transaction, "is the payment I made to cover his car loan when he defaulted 3 months ago." Scott's face had gone from confident tan to sickly gray. "Richard, you don't understand. I was going to pay you back when the franchise deals went through." "What franchise deals?" I asked, pulling out another set of papers. "You mean the ones where you've been using my properties as collateral without my permission? The ones where you've been representing yourself as the owner of assets that belong to me?" Nancy's hand slowly withdrew from Scott's arm, like she'd been touching something contaminated. "Scott, is this true?" He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. For the first time in his life, Scott was completely speechless. I continued pulling documents from the folder. Financial statements showing Scott's actual income versus his expenses. Credit reports revealing the loans I'd co-signed, the debts I'd covered, the financial house of cards I'd been holding up for more than a decade. Your successful boyfriend, I said to Nancy, makes $42,000 a year as a gym trainer. His rent, car payments, insurance, and basic living expenses come to about $58,000 annually. Care to guess where the difference comes from? David was studying the papers with the concentration of a man trying to solve a puzzle. Jesus, Richard, you've been supporting him this whole time? Supporting him, covering for him, letting him play the role of the successful brother, while I stayed in the background being practical. I turned back to Nancy, who looked like she might be sick. Every dinner you admired at his house was paid for with my money. Every vacation he told you about was financed through my credit. Every story about his business success was built on my investments. Nancy's voice was barely a whisper. Why didn't you tell me? I laughed, and I could hear the bitterness in my own voice. Because you were so impressed with his success. Because you kept telling me I should be more like him. Because you made it clear that you preferred the fantasy to the reality. Scott finally found his voice. It's not like that, Nancy. I was building something. I was going to make it all back and more. With what? I asked, pulling out the final document from the folder. With this? It was a letter from Scott's lawyer dated 3 weeks ago. A formal request to use my properties as collateral for a loan he wanted to take out. A loan for $200,000 that he planned to use to expand his gym business. A loan that would have put my properties at risk if he defaulted. You were going to mortgage my buildings without telling me, I said, watching Scott's face crumble. You were going to risk everything I'd worked for to fund your next scheme. Nancy was shaking her head, her perfect hairstyle falling apart as she ran her hands through it. I don't understand. If you own everything, if you've been paying for everything, then why did you let you think what? That I was the failure? That I was the one who wasn't good enough? I gathered the papers back into the folder, my movements deliberate and controlled. Because I was tired, Nancy. I was tired of propping up Scott's ego, tired of pretending his success wasn't built on my work, tired of being treated like the family disappointment when I was the only one actually succeeding. Margaret was staring at Scott like she'd never seen him before. Scott, how could you do this? How could you lie to all of us? I wasn't lying, he said desperately. I was going to make it work. The business was going to take off, and I was going to pay Richard back everything. When? I asked. Oh, when were you going to pay back the $340,000 you've borrowed from me over the years? When were you going to start making real payments instead of just covering the minimum to keep your credit afloat? Nancy's wine glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor, red wine spreading across the white carpet like blood. She didn't even notice. $340,000, she repeated. I nodded. Principal, interest, and opportunity cost. That's what it's cost me to maintain the illusion that Scott is successful. The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Nancy was staring at Scott like she was seeing him for the first time. Scott was slumped in his chair, looking like a deflated balloon. Margaret and David were exchanging glances, probably calculating how much of their own admiration for Scott had been based on lies. So when you talk about leaving me for a successful man, I said to Nancy, you should know that you're actually leaving a successful man for someone who's been living off that success like a parasite. Nancy's breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. I need some air. She stood up abruptly, her chair falling backward, and rushed toward the back door. Scott started to follow her, but I held up my hand. I wouldn't, I said quietly. She's going to need some time to process the fact that she just destroyed her marriage for a man who can't even afford his own rent. Scott sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. The golden boy, the family success story, the man my wife preferred over me, was finally showing his true face. And it was the face of someone who had never actually succeeded at anything except taking credit for other people's work. But I wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. The back door slammed shut behind Nancy, leaving the rest of us in a silence so thick it felt like we were underwater. Scott sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly. Margaret and David were still processing what they'd just learned, their eyes moving between the scattered documents and their younger brother, who had just been revealed as a fraud. I walked to the window and could see Nancy standing by her car in the driveway, her phone pressed to her ear, probably calling her sister or maybe one of her friends from the gym, the ones who had been encouraging her to leave me for someone more exciting. "Richard," Scott's voice was barely audible. "I can explain." I turned back to face him, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Explain what, exactly? Explain how you've been lying to everyone for 15 years? Explain how you were planning to risk my property for your gambling debts? Or explain how you seduced my wife by pretending to be something you're not?" Margaret cleared her throat. "Scott, is all of this true? The money, the properties, everything?" Scott looked up at her, his face red and blotchy. "It's not as simple as Richard is making it sound. I was building something. I was going to pay him back. With money you don't have," David said, his voice flat, "or a business you don't actually own." I pulled out my phone and scrolled to my recent calls. Speaking of which, I think there are a few more things you all should know. I hit the speakerphone button and dialed a number I'd called earlier that evening. "Kellerman Properties. This is James." "James, it's Richard. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all, Mr. Kellerman. Did you want me to proceed with tomorrow's transfers?" I looked directly at Scott as I answered. "Yes, I want all properties currently leased to Scott Kellerman transferred back to direct management, effective immediately." Scott's face went white. "Richard, what are you doing?" James continued speaking through the phone. "And the gym leases? Should I proceed with the non-renewal notices?" "Yes," I said, watching Scott's expression crumble. 30 days notice, as specified in the contracts." "Very good, sir. The paperwork will be ready for your signature first thing in the morning." I hung up and looked around the table. That was my property management company. As of tomorrow morning, Scott will need to find new locations for his gyms. The leases he's been operating under for the past 15 years are being terminated. "You can't do that," Scott said, standing up so fast his chair fell over. "Those are my businesses." "No," I said calmly, "they're my buildings. And I've decided I no longer want to rent them to someone who has been misrepresenting his relationship with the properties to potential investors." Margaret was staring at me with something that looked like awe. "Richard, I had no idea you owned all of this." "Because I never felt the need to brag about it," I said. "Unlike some people, I don't measure my worth by how impressed other people are with my possessions." David was looking through the financial documents again. "Jesus, Scott, you owe Richard almost as much as my house is worth." "And that brings us to the next item of business," I said, pulling out another folder I'd been saving. "Nancy," I called toward the back door. After a moment, she came back inside, her eyes red and her makeup smeared. She'd obviously been crying, which was more emotion than she'd shown me in the past 5 years of our marriage. "Sit down," I said, not unkindly. "We're not finished." "More." She sat heavily in her chair, avoiding eye contact with everyone. "Richard, I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything yet," I told her. "First, you need to understand the full scope of your situation." I opened the second folder and pulled out a document that made Nancy's breath catch in her throat. "This is a record of every credit card transaction, every bank withdrawal, every expense you've charged to our joint accounts over the past 2 years. Her face went pale as I spread the papers across the table. "The spa treatments, the new wardrobe, the jewelry, the expensive dinners, all paid for with money from my businesses while you were planning to leave me for a man you thought was wealthier." "Richard, please," she whispered. "The personal trainer sessions at Scott's gym," I continued, reading from the list. $60 per session, 3 times a week for 8 months. The weekend trips to the resort in Scottsdale. The new car you bought last month without discussing it with me. Do you want to guess how much you've spent preparing to leave me?" Nancy's hands were shaking as she reached for her wine glass, then remembered it was broken on the floor. "I don't know." $47,000, I said, letting the number hang in the air. "In 8 months, you spent $47,000 of my money preparing to divorce me for a man who couldn't afford to take you to dinner without my financial support." Scott looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Nancy, I didn't know she was spending that much. Of course you didn't, I said. Because you've never had to think about money. You've never had to budget or plan or worry about whether you could afford something. You've been living in a fantasy where Richard's money appears whenever you need it. Nancy was crying now, real tears that were smearing her mascara down her cheeks. What do you want from me, Richard? You want me to beg? You want me to say I'm sorry? I looked at her for a long moment. This woman I'd loved for 32 years, who had been planning to destroy our marriage for a man who couldn't even afford his own rent. I don't want anything from you, Nancy. That's the point. I'm done wanting things from people who don't value what I've given them. I pulled out the final document from the folder. This is a petition for divorce that I filed 3 weeks ago. It cites adultery, which means you won't be entitled to alimony or half of our assets under state law. Nancy's face went from pale to gray. You can't do that. I can, and I have. I've documented your affair, your fraudulent use of marital funds, and your abandonment of the marriage. My lawyer says it's one of the most straightforward cases he's ever seen. Margaret was shaking her head. Nancy, how could you be so stupid? She wasn't stupid, I said. She was logical. She looked at 2 men and chose the one she thought was more successful. She just didn't have all the information she needed to make an informed decision. Scott stood up again, his face flushed with anger. You're destroying both of us over this? I'm not destroying anyone, I said calmly. I'm simply stopping my financial support of people who have been lying to me, stealing from me, and humiliating me. You're both adults. You're both capable of supporting yourselves. You just haven't had to because I've been doing it for you. Nancy looked up at me with something that might have been hope. Richard, if we could just talk about this privately, if we could work something out. I shook my head. There's nothing to work out. You made your choice in front of our entire family. You chose Scott over me. Now you can have him, exactly as he is, with exactly what he actually brings to the table. I started gathering the documents back into their folders. Scott, you have 30 days to find new locations for your gyms, assuming you can find someone else to co-sign your leases. You also have 30 days to find a new place to live, since the house you've been renting from me is no longer available. Scott's voice cracked. Where am I supposed to get the money for new deposits, new leases? My credit is shot. I don't know, I said honestly. That's not my problem anymore. Nancy was sobbing now, her carefully constructed evening completely destroyed. Richard, please. We've been married for 32 years. That has to count for something. I looked at her one last time, remembering the young woman who had promised to love me in sickness and in health, or richer or poorer. It did count for something. It counted for 15 years of me supporting your boyfriend's lifestyle while you fell in love with the illusion I was paying to maintain. I picked up the folders and walked toward the door. Margaret, David, thank you for coming to dinner. I hope you enjoyed the show. As I reached the doorway, I turned back one last time. Nancy was staring at Scott like she was seeing him for the first time. Scott was staring at the floor like he was trying to figure out how his world had collapsed so completely in the span of one evening. Oh, and Nancy, I said softly, your successful boyfriend still owes me $340,000. If you're planning a future together, you might want to factor that into your financial planning. The last thing I heard as I walked down the hallway was Nancy asking Scott, in a voice barely above a whisper, how much money do you actually have? I didn't stay to hear his answer. I already knew it was nothing. The next morning, I woke up alone in my bedroom for the first time in 32 years, and instead of feeling empty, I felt lighter than I had in decades. Nancy's side of the bed was untouched. Her car hadn't been in the driveway when I went to sleep, and it wasn't there when I woke up. I assumed she'd spent the night at Scott's, which was fitting since they'd have to figure out their living arrangements pretty quickly. I made myself coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, going through emails from James at the property management company. The paperwork was already in motion. By noon, Scott would receive official notice that his gym leases were being terminated. By evening, he'd have formal notification that his house rental agreement was ending in 30 days. My phone had been buzzing all morning with calls from Nancy, but I didn't answer. There was nothing left to discuss. She'd made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. At 9:30, Margaret called. "Richard?" Her voice was strained, like she'd been up all night. "I need to talk to you." "About what?" "About Scott and Nancy. They're here, at my house. They showed up at 7 this morning." I took a sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter taste. "And?" "Scott's in bad shape, Richard. Really bad. He keeps saying his life is over, that he's going to lose everything." "He already lost everything," I said calmly. "He just didn't realize it wasn't his to begin with." Margaret sighed heavily. "Look, I know what they did was terrible, but he's still our brother." "Is he?" I asked. "Because brothers don't usually steal from each other for 15 years and then seduce each other's wives." There was a long pause. "Nancy wants to talk to you. She says she'll do anything to fix this." I laughed, a short, bitter sound. "There's nothing to fix, Margaret. This isn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This is the consequence of choices they both made with full knowledge of what they were doing. She says she'll end things with Scott. She says she wants to save your marriage." "Of course she does," I said, "now that she knows Scott can't afford to support her." "Tell me something, Margaret. If Scott actually had been wealthy, if he actually could have given her a better life than I could, do you think she'd be at your house begging for forgiveness?" Margaret didn't answer, which was answer enough. "That's what I thought," I continued. "Nancy doesn't want to save our marriage. She wants to save her financial security. There's a difference." I hung up and went back to my emails. By 10 o'clock, I had confirmation that all of Scott's business accounts had been frozen pending resolution of his outstanding debts to me. By 11, his credit cards had been declined when he tried to buy gas. By noon, he was calling me directly. I answered on the 4th ring. "Richard, please." His voice was desperate, panicked. "We need to talk." "We don't need to do anything," I said. "You need to find a way to support yourself without stealing from me. I need to continue living my life without people who've been lying to me for over a decade." "I wasn't stealing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I was borrowing. I always intended to pay you back." "With what money, Scott? Your gym trainer salary? Your non-existent franchise deals? Your gambling winnings?" Silence. "That's what I thought," I continued. "You never intended to pay me back because you never had a realistic plan for earning the money to do it. You just assumed I'd keep supporting your lifestyle indefinitely while you played the role of the successful brother." "What am I supposed to do?" he asked. And for the first time in his life, Scott sounded truly frightened. "I can't afford to relocate the gyms. I can't afford deposits on new leases. I don't have money for a new place to live." "You could get a job," I suggested. "A real job that pays enough to support yourself. Lots of people do it." "Richard, come on. I'm 45 years old. I don't have skills for anything else." "You have 15 years of experience running fitness centers," I pointed out. "Someone else might hire you to manage their gym. Of course, you'd have to be honest about your actual qualifications instead of pretending you own the places you work." Another long silence. Then, in a voice so small I almost felt sorry for him, "Nancy left." I set down my coffee cup. "What do you mean?" "She left this morning, after she found out how much money I actually make, after she realized I can't afford to take care of her the way she wants. She packed her bags and left." Despite everything, I felt a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction. "Where did she go?" "I don't know. She said she needed time to think. She said she'd made a terrible mistake, but I don't think she was talking about the affair. I think she was talking about leaving you for me." I almost laughed. Nancy's pattern was so predictable. When she thought Scott was successful, I was the mistake. Now that she knew the truth about Scott's finances, he was the mistake. It was never about love or compatibility or building a life together. It was always about who could provide the lifestyle she wanted. "Richard," Scott continued, his voice breaking slightly, "I know I screwed up. I know I hurt you. But I'm scared. I don't know how to fix this." For a moment, just a moment, I remembered the little brother who used to follow me around when we were kids. The one who looked up to me before he learned to resent me for being more responsible than he was. But then I remembered 32 years of marriage destroyed by his selfishness and Nancy's greed. "You fix it by learning to stand on your own 2 feet, I said. "You fix it by getting a job that pays your actual bills instead of depending on other people to subsidize your fantasies. You fix it by accepting that actions have consequences, and yours have finally caught up with you." "I'll lose everything." "You never had anything to lose, Scott. You've been living with my money and my buildings, pretending to own a business that belongs to me. You can't lose what was never yours." I hung up before he could respond. That afternoon, Nancy finally showed up at the house. I watched from the living room window as she sat in her car for almost 10 minutes before getting up the courage to come to the door. When she finally knocked, I took my time answering. She looked terrible. Her hair was unwashed, her makeup was smeared, and she was wearing the same clothes she'd had on the night before. This was not the polished, confident woman who had announced her affair at Christmas dinner. "Richard," she said, her voice hoarse, "please, can we talk?" I stepped aside to let her in, but I didn't offer her coffee or ask her to sit down. I just waited. "I made a mistake," she began, the words rushing out like she'd been practicing them. "A terrible, terrible mistake. I don't know what I was thinking. I was confused, and Scott was so charming, and I thought—" "You thought he had money," I finished for her. Her face crumpled. "It wasn't about money." I stared at her until she looked away. "Nancy, you spent $47,000 of my money preparing to leave me for a man you thought was wealthy. You humiliated me in front of our entire family because you believed Scott could give you a better life than I could. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this wasn't about money." She started crying again, the same desperate tears from the night before. "I know how it looks, but I love you, Richard. I've always loved you." "No," I said quietly. "You loved my stability. You loved my reliability. You loved the fact that I provided for you without asking questions or demanding recognition. But when you thought you found someone who could provide more, you didn't hesitate to throw 32 years away." "I was wrong," she sobbed. "I was so wrong. Scott isn't who I thought he was. He can't take care of me. He can't even take care of himself." There it was. The truth she probably didn't even realize she was telling. She wasn't sorry about the affair. She wasn't sorry about hurting me. She was sorry that she'd bet on the wrong horse. "Nancy," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "do you understand that if Scott actually had been wealthy, you'd be with him right now? You understand that you're only here because your backup plan fell through?" She opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again. We both knew it was true. "I want you to leave," I said. "I want you to pack your things and find somewhere else to live. The divorce papers are already filed. My lawyer will be in touch about the details." "Richard, please," she begged. 32 years has to count for something. We can work through this. We can go to counseling. We can start over." I looked at this woman who had shared my life for more than 3 decades, who had promised to love me in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, who had broken those promises the moment she thought she'd found someone richer. "Those 32 years do count for something," I said. "They count as 32 years of my life that I'll never get back. 32 years of building something with someone who was always looking for something better." She collapsed into the chair by the door, her sobs echoing through the house that had been our home for so long. But I felt nothing, no sympathy, no regret, no desire to comfort her. She had made her choice, and now I was making mine. "You have until the end of the week to get your things," I said. "After that, the locks will be changed." I walked upstairs and left her crying in the entryway. Through my bedroom window, I could see Scott's car in the driveway waiting for her. Even now, even after everything, they were still together. Not because they loved each other, but because they had nowhere else to go. It was perfect, really. They deserved each other. 1 year later, I sat on the deck of my new house overlooking Lake Travis, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and orange. The house was smaller than the one I'd shared with Nancy, but it was mine in a way that place had never been. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, every book on the shelf was there because I wanted it there, not because someone else thought it looked impressive or expensive. The past year had been a revelation. I discovered what it felt like to live without constantly managing other people's crises, without subsidizing other people's dreams, without pretending that other people's failures were somehow my responsibility. For the first time in my adult life, my money was my own, my time was my own, and my peace of mind was my own. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago. Nancy had tried to fight it, hiring a lawyer with money she'd borrowed from her sister, but the evidence of her adultery was overwhelming. She'd walked away with her personal belongings and nothing else. No alimony, no share of the house, no claim on my business assets. Texas law was clear about abandonment and adultery, and my lawyer had documented everything meticulously. I'd heard through Margaret that Nancy was working as a receptionist at a medical office in downtown Austin, living in a one-bedroom apartment that was a far cry from the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. She'd tried to contact me several times, but I'd blocked her number after the third voicemail begging me to reconsider. There was nothing to reconsider. She'd shown me exactly who she was when she thought she had a better option, and I'd chosen to believe her. Scott's situation was even more dramatic. Without my financial support, his house of cards had collapsed completely. He'd lost all 3 gym locations when he couldn't make the deposits for new leases. He'd tried to get a job managing someone else's fitness center, but word had gotten around about his misrepresentation of assets and his poor business practices. The fitness industry in Austin was smaller than he had realized, and his reputation was ruined. The last I'd heard, he was working at a chain gym, making $15 an hour, and living in a studio apartment near the airport. His BMW had been repossessed, his credit was destroyed, and he was facing bankruptcy. The golden boy had finally discovered what it felt like to live without his older brother cleaning up his messes. Margaret had tried to mediate a few times, suggesting that maybe I was being too harsh, that families should forgive and forget. But I'd asked her a simple question. If I forgave them and let them back into my life, what was to stop them from doing the same thing again the next time they thought they'd found a better deal? She hadn't had an answer for that. David, on the other hand, had been surprisingly supportive. He'd told me that watching Scott's facade crumble had been eye-opening for him too. He'd realized how much of his own admiration for his uncle had been based on illusions I'd been paying to maintain. "I never realized how much you'd sacrificed for this family," he'd said to me a few months ago, "and I never realized how little they appreciated it." But the real surprise had come from an unexpected source. Her name was Elena, and I'd met her at a bookstore in downtown Austin, where I'd started spending my Saturday mornings. She was 62, a retired teacher who'd lost her husband 5 years earlier to cancer. She was reading a biography of Theodore Roosevelt when I struck up a conversation about history, and we'd ended up talking for 3 hours over coffee. Elena was different from Nancy in every way that mattered. She was interested in ideas, not impressions. She valued character over status. She'd built a modest but comfortable life through her own hard work and careful planning, and she wasn't looking for someone to rescue her or elevate her lifestyle. She was simply looking for a companionship with someone who shared her interests and values. We'd been seeing each other for 8 months now, and it was the most genuine relationship I'd ever had. Elena knew my story. I told her everything about Nancy and Scott and the divorce, but she was more interested in who I was now than who I'd been married to or what I'd lost in the process. "You didn't lose anything," she'd said when I'd finished telling her about the Christmas dinner disaster. "You got rid of people who were using you. That's not a loss, that's a gain." She was right, of course. My net worth had actually increased substantially once I'd stopped subsidizing Scott's lifestyle and Nancy's shopping habits. My stress levels had dropped dramatically once I'd stopped fielding crisis calls about Scott's latest financial emergency or Nancy's latest disappointment with my lack of ambition. My sleep had improved once I'd stopped lying awake, wondering if I was doing enough, earning enough, being enough for people who would never be satisfied. The business was thriving too. Without the distraction of family drama and the constant drain of Scott's financial needs, I'd been able to focus on expansion. I'd bought 2 more hardware stores, invested in a small construction company, and partnered with a developer on a residential project that was exceeding all expectations. At 68, I was more successful than I'd ever been, and for the first time, that success was truly mine. As I sat watching the lake, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Elena. "Dinner ready in an hour. Bring wine." I smiled and headed inside to choose a bottle from the wine collection I'd started building. Another small pleasure I discovered in my new life, the ability to spend money on things I enjoyed, without having to justify the expense to someone who saw it as frivolous. As I was getting ready to leave, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer when I saw it was Margaret, but something made me pick up. "Richard," her voice was subdued, "I thought you should know. Scott's in the hospital." I felt a flicker of something, concern maybe, or just curiosity. "What happened?" "He collapsed at work yesterday. Exhaustion, the doctor said, and stress. He's been working 2 jobs trying to make ends meet, and I guess his body just gave out." I waited for her to ask me to visit him, to help him, to forgive him, and restore the family peace. But she didn't. "I'm not asking you to do anything," she said quietly. "I just thought you should know." "Is he going to be okay?" "Physically, yes, but Richard, he's not the same person he was a year ago. The arrogance is gone. The entitlement is gone. He's just broken." I thought about that for a moment. A year ago, Scott's crisis would have sent me rushing to the hospital with my checkbook, ready to solve whatever problem had landed him there. Now I felt nothing but a distant kind of sadness for the waste of it all. "People have to hit bottom sometimes before they can start rebuilding," I said finally. "Maybe this will be good for him in the long run." "Maybe," Margaret agreed. "Nancy's been to see him a few times. I think they're back together, sort of. They're both pretty desperate at this point." "They deserve each other," I said, and I meant it without malice. They were 2 people who had never learned to value what they had, only to want what they thought they were missing. Now they were both missing everything, and maybe they'd finally learn to appreciate each other. "Richard," Margaret's voice was hesitant, "I owe you an apology. We all do. I don't think any of us realized how much you'd done for this family, or how little we'd given you in return." "It's okay, Margaret," I said, and I meant that too. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done." After I hung up, I sat in my car for a moment before driving to Elena's house. A year ago, Margaret's call would have ruined my evening, filled me with guilt and obligation and the pressure to fix someone else's problems. Now it was just information about people who had chosen to be strangers. Elena greeted me at the door with a smile that lit up her whole face. She was wearing a simple blue dress and had flour in her hair from whatever she'd been baking. She looked beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with expensive clothes or professional styling. "How was your day?" she asked as I handed her the wine. "Peaceful," I said, and realized that was true in a way it hadn't been for most of my adult life. We had dinner on her patio, talking about books and travel plans and the garden she was planning for the spring. Simple conversations between 2 people who enjoyed each other's company without drama or agenda or hidden motives. As we were cleaning up, Elena asked, "Any word from your former life today?" I told her about Margaret's call, about Scott in the hospital, about Nancy's return to his side now that they were both facing reality. Elena listened without judgment, then said, "Do you feel bad about it, about not helping?" I considered the question seriously. "No," I said finally. "I feel sad that it came to this, but I don't feel responsible for fixing it. For the first time in my life, other people's problems are their own problems." She nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. It takes courage to stop rescuing people who don't want to be saved. That night, as I drove home to my quiet house by the lake, I thought about how completely my life had changed. A year ago, I'd been a man whose worth was measured by how much I could do for people who didn't appreciate it. Now, I was a man whose worth was measured by my own standards in my own life, with people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, but it didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the deck again, listening to the gentle sound of water against the shore. My phone was silent. No crisis calls, no emergencies requiring my immediate attention and financial intervention. No one needed me to solve their problems or fund their dreams or enable their irresponsibility. For the first time in decades, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, with exactly the life I deserved. I had learned the difference between being needed and being used, between family loyalty and family enabling, between love and financial convenience. At 68 years old, I was finally free, and it was the most beautiful Christmas gift I'd ever given myself.